Police Minister Bheki Cele says the spectre of violence will not be allowed to ruin the smooth running of the elections come next week Monday. That's as the state security threat assessment revealed that 270 to 300 hotspots are being closely monitored by the SAPS. Defence Minister Thandi Modise is saying that the country is relatively stable and conditions are conducive for a free and fair election. Let's get you a sense of what else to think about at this time, bringing the ISS Africa Justice and Violence Program Research Consultant, quite a mouthful, Godfrey Mulaudzi, who joins us now for his assessment of the state of affairs. And Godfrey, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for speaking to us on Newzroom Afrika. Let me just get a broad stroke take from your end about whether or not you believe what the ministers had to say yesterday goes far enough in allaying fears that there'd be any kind of turbulence come the 1st of November.
Good morning, Ayanda and the viewers of Newzroom Afrika. The turbulence on the 1st of November, we don't see it in that dimension the minister had mentioned it. Of course, the over 270 hotspots are the voting stations. And if you look back in the past, elections, of course, the election period, have always provided a platform for communities to raise their concern. And normally around the days of the voter registrations, around the days of elections, society tends to up the end and, either barricade, disrupt the voting stations or the voting registration stations. But it has never been to an extent where it threatened the right of people to vote. It has just been an issue revolving around service delivery. So it has never been around where people do not accept the process of elections or the, just the mere disruptions of election processes.
Sure. It's an interesting point that you're making because the framing of the protest until this point has always almost as if the protesters themselves are specifically trying to interrupt with the democratic ecosystem. But the point you're making is an important one. Usually, all that the protesters are using is the very elections to point to other issues like service delivery concerns.
That is so, very much so, because the space of local government, if we were to look specifically on local government election, this is the space, the platform where communities knows that local government interface with them in as far as service delivery is concerned. And if you look in our space, you would realize that the space of service delivery in our communities is slowly collapsing. Various media houses have run out from the voter registration weekends towards this, the 1st of November elections. They have been running the so-called election program, but focusing on communities that have major service delivery problems. Now, communities have in the past been raising these issues to their local leaders and have also not received joy in return. Now, what normally happens is that this is the platform where they feel that they need to show politicians what we call a protest vote. So it's either communities come together and say, we are not going to vote if you don't fix the water issues in our communities. We are not going to vote if you don't fix electricity issues in our communities. And of course, if you look in the history of our protests in the country, there is a concern which we have, the violence that accompanies these protests. That is a very much prime concern because other than that, our Constitution, Section 17, gives us the right to protest but peacefully. Now, given and I think there is also a huge debt of trust from the community to local political leaders that is slowly growing as well. You would see that these protests in various communities are largely led by civil society organizations across the country. And of course, the hotspot, as the ministers have outlined, are the urban provinces, but he has omitted Free State and the Northwest Province. These are areas where even during the voter registration period, there has been number of voting stations that have been disrupted, either IEC officials being held hostage, but it never went to an extent where the whole day has been wasted by the protesters, but they needed to send a message. But again, we know from our research that violence in our protests has been used as a bargaining tool to get attention from the powers that be. So the violence, that is a prime concern, but other than that, you can't deny people their right to protest.
Yeah.
At the same time, people have the right to vote and to be voted for. So that I think the police department, the security architecture needs to really focus on quelling violence, and that it is solely so because of the gap that political leaders live with their local communities. So there has been that growing gap, and you would see in this protest, we hardly see politicians go to address these issues, but you would see police being sent to respond to these protests. And that also angers communities.
Right.
Because communities need to address this to their political leaders. For example, they would say, we have had a public meeting on the so-and-so date. You were here, you promised to come back to us, but you never came back to us. Today, we still don't have water. Now, these are pressing concerns, and I think that this, we could see now, and I'm very, and I see recently the president himself of the country has been, of course, running across the country with the campaign of his party, taking ownership of the failure of local government. But we don't see local government mayors, councillors going to communities taking ownership of these issues, because they know that these communities are angered, and rightfully so.
Right. If I can come in there, Godfrey, I mean, let's speak a bit more about the complexity of the violence that usually characterizes this unrest in some respects. I mean, how best does law enforcement even respond to that without possibly escalating the situation, given what's ultimately at stake? I mean, it was in 2016 and 2019 where about, I think it was 4 or 5 tents that had been erected for the purpose of the election were actually burned down. You can't necessarily afford that to happen because of the implications for the people who ultimately wouldn't be able to participate in our democracy. However, if you don't respond accurately, you might be dealing with a bigger disaster on your hands, given how charged the space typically is.
That is correct, Ayanda. I mean, look, it goes back to exactly what we're saying, and our research confirms that, because local leaders, if they don't respond to, because this crisis don't start during the election day or the registration date of the voter registration weekend. These are build-up processes. These are build-up anger that the community has. But because they have not been given attention, it goes to the last day of the elections. Because people know that elections, we are going to vote for the local leaders that are going to represent us to solve these issues. But these people are not coming to us, and if they do, are they doing so timelessly? Are their response effective? And we want to argue that they are not effective and they're not timeless. Because if you have community, because this is the space where, in fact, it is too late for them to go to communities to want to respond to, for example, a water crisis or a pothole in Merafong in the Val that has been there for years. Now, what makes it worse is political leaders are going to communities at this space during their campaigns, making furthermore promises. And some of them make irresponsible promise of things that they may not be able to achieve. Now, these things angers communities. And like I'm saying, look, the nature here in our country, you would see in a small protest of displeasure with the candidate, for example, of Party AX and so forth.
Absolutely.
The tent of the IEC is going to be banned. In a mere protest against demarcation, 27 schools will be banned. So this speaks to the culture of violence within our protest. That needs to be addressed. And for law enforcement to be able to cut down on that, to be able to narrow that down, that takes the community leaders' effort. That will be able to go and speak to communities. You will not be able to have law enforcement to go and address the water crisis in community A. That is the space where local leaders need to be proactive, needs to be frequently having community meetings with their constituencies, explaining where they could not get it right, why they could not get it right. And community understand. We've seen that where there's been frequent engagement, frequent dialogue between leaders and communities, there seems to be a smooth conflict resolution process there. We tend to quell much of, if you look in villages, for example, the out countryside provinces, there's large scale of poor service delivered. You could hardly find, for example, the communities of one protesting against lack of electricity or electricity cut-off.
Yeah.
You will see a protest in Soweto, for example, where there's been the cut-off of electricity for 2 days or 2 nights. But there in Soweto, a BRT station is going to be vandalized because there's been a cut-off, there's been load shedding. So the culture of violence, and I think that the ministers you were speaking about these urban provinces as their hotspot areas, it is correct. But Northwest Province itself, it's a rural province, but there's a large problem of service delivery in that province. You would have seen during the voter registration weekend as well.
Yeah.
Almost 10 voting stations have been disrupted in that province.
Godfrey, let me come in there and ask this very quickly. Apologies for interrupting you before we run out of time. I just want to gauge from you whether you think, given the work and the research you've been able to do, if our government is actually even equipped to respond appropriately to these protests. Leave aside whether or not they do they even have enough capacity to do so, even if they were to be advised accurately about the best response to give to any kind of flare-up on the 1st of November?
No, definitely, and they do have both, the capacity as well and the willingness. But I remind you again, the space of election is not only in the interest of law enforcement. Political parties themselves, it is in their interest that elections move smoothly, freely, and fair, that the outcome can be acceptable by both. Now, political leaders will play their role here to make sure that communities are engaged where there are potential eruptions of disruptions or protests or blocking the voting stations. But other than that, look, I don't see that we would have a significant number of those blockades because political parties are also playing their part. Now, it is in their interest largely than anything else that the elections move smoothly. So we don't really see, in terms of our hotspots, in terms of our monitor, we don't see a large scale of the disruptions. But of course, there's going the hotspots areas that have already been mapped out. Those are areas of concern.
Right. Godfrey Mulaudzi, thanks very much indeed for your take. Really do appreciate it here on the AM Report. Godfrey is a research consultant with ISS's Africa Justice and Violence Program. Once again, thanks very much indeed.